Kicking off at number 5, Road Games, 1981.
Now, he's just killed a girl.
Did he make love to her first?
I don't know. What's the difference?
It makes a lot of difference. I think in order to play the game properly, we have to know what he thinks of women.
And the fact that this film is widely forgotten by the mainstream is a feat in and of itself, because stylistically, Road Games is a visual treat that was way ahead of its time. It's also widely considered by none other than Quentin Tarantino to be his favourite film ever made. If that's not an accolade, I don't know what is. Released in 1981, Road Games is an Australian horror thriller set in the outback, produced and directed by Richard Franklin and written by Everett de Roche, and starring, you just wait for it, the one, the only, Jamie Lee Curtis, during a time when her career as the greatest final girl of horror history had already been cemented in John Carpenter's Halloween. She figured she'd head over to Australia, shoot this film, and then everyone kind of forgot about it. But they shouldn't have, because it's really good. What plays out is an incredibly straightforward storyline. A truck driver named Patrick Quid, played by the formidable Stacey Keach, travels across the outback, picks up a hitchhiker, Jamie Lee Curtis, all the while a killer is on the loose. And because of that simple storyline, what plays out is an almost Hitchcockian runaway train, with direct nods to the tight dialogue and characterization of Rear Window and North by Northwest. If you're into equal parts sweeping vistas and equal parts close quarters violence, you will absolutely love this film.
Coming in at number 4, one of my personal favourites, Trick or Treat. Michael Dougherty's Trick or Treat is perhaps the finest ode to Halloween ever created, and that's saying something. Released in 2007, this anthology film relates 4 Halloween horror stories with a common element in them: Sam, a mysterious child trick-or-treater wearing shabby orange footy pajamas with a burlap sack over his head. He is absolutely terrifying, trust me. The character in turn makes an appearance in each of the stories whenever a character breaks Halloween tradition. In this chilling horror, the residents of a small town are not quite what they seem. The local principal is a child-murdering sociopath, and the nubile virgin a wolf in sheep's clothing. Now, what makes this movie so effective is Michael Dougherty's obvious love and respect for the horror genre, tradition, holiday lore, and superstition. Without naming any names or dragging any previous horrors about Halloween, Trick or Treat is quite simply the quintessential Halloween film. Now, the film currently holds an approval rating of 84% on Rotten Tomatoes, with the general consensus reading a deftly crafted tribute to Halloween legends. Trick or Treat hits all the genre marks with gusto and old-fashioned suspense. Honestly, if you want to gear up for Halloween 2020, considering we're all in quarantine, we don't have anything else to do, I suggest you check out this holiday classic now. Coming in at number 3, I've said it once, I've said it again, Session 9 is one of the greatest films. Brad Anderson blessed the horror genre with a small tale of encroaching madness that is absolutely haunting to behold. This 2001 psychological horror stars David Caruso, Peter Mullen, and Josh Lucas, and follows an asbestos abatement crew who begin to experience growing tensions while working in an abandoned mental asylum. This is paralleled by the gradual revelation of a former patient's disturbed past through recorded audio tapes of her regression sessions. Now, it should be said that there is really not much that is inherently terrifying about this film. There are no real jump scares, no blood or gore, and the pace is slow and action low. That rhymed. However, this slow burn has a way of creeping up on you, as the boundaries of sanity are blurred within the confines of an abandoned mental asylum. As the horror begins to unfold, a Lovecraftian descent into madness sweeps through the asylum, affecting every single crew member as they turn on each other, vanish, and reappear in this truly creepy narrative. Session 9 received mixed reviews, with the film currently holding a 63 approval rating, which is incredibly undeserving. It should be way higher. Bloody Disgusting ranked the film 5th in its list of 20 best horror films of the 2000s, writing, "Session 9 isn't just a cheap hack and slash, instantly forgettable type horror film, but a psychologically probing, deeply unsettling journey off the edge and into the abyss of the human mind." Honestly, I can't stress enough how frightening this movie is, not to mention its chilling conclusion. Please check it out. Next up at number 2, we have Eden Lake. If this list has taught us anything thus far, it's that the 2000s were filled to the brim with some of the greatest underrated horror movies of our time. Eden Lake was one of the greatest. Released in 2008, this British horror stars Kelly Riley and Michael Fassbender, as well as a very young Jack O'Connell. The plot concerns Jenny, a teacher, and her boyfriend Steve, who head to a lake to spend a peaceful weekend. However, a group of undisciplined teenagers irk them with their continuous pranks, ruining their weekend. And it is far more than childish pranks, with the weekend becoming a fight to survive for everyone involved. Now, the film itself is among a group of roughly contemporaneous films that deal with concerns over broken Britain and fears of hoodies. Now, for those not from the UK, broken Britain refers to a perceived widespread state of social decay in the UK, with hoodies being at the forefront, also referred to as chavs, lawless individuals who have no respect for society. But back to the film. After the couple confront the gang of unruly teens, their weekend descends into madness, as conversation escalates with the teens quickly revealing themselves to be a sadistic force of violence. We hate to see it. Thankfully, the movie cleverly avoids the classist bent that threatens at every turn, instead focusing on the pressures and dangers of groupthink. Eden Lake was met with mostly positive reviews, with Rotten Tomatoes giving it 79%, with the general consensus reading, a brutal and effective British hoodie horror that, despite the cliches, stays on the right side of scary. The movie, particularly if you're from Britain, is a truly harrowing experience, with many having their own stories of hooded thugs. It is a chilling experience that will linger in the pit of your stomach for days, even months. And last on our list, we have Triangle. From writer-director Christopher Smith, who put a delightfully cheeky spin on the backwards slasher genre with Severance, he got even more creative with the 2009 movie Triangle. This psychological horror stars Melissa George and a young Liam Hemsworth, and centers on George's character who portrays a single mother who goes on a boating trip with several friends. However, when they are forced to abandon their ship in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle, they board a derelict ocean liner where they become convinced that someone is stalking them. Now, George's character Jess is a woman with an undisclosed source of agony behind her surface level calm, with plenty being revealed throughout the duration of the movie. Now, it's tough to even discuss the film without giving away its twists and turns, which are superbly executed throughout. However, what I can say is that a vicious time loop thrusts the group into a nightmare scenario, with Jess emerging at a pivotal time that may be the key to their escape. Now, overlapping timelines is incredibly difficult to execute. However, Christopher Smith does this with grace, displaying the horrors of being trapped in one hellish loop. The film was received well by critics and viewers alike, with the movie garnering an approval rating of 80%, with the general consensus reading, Triangle sails into some strange waters, but this intelligent, well-acted horror outing anchors its idiosyncrasies in a satisfying, scary story. Honestly, this film has stayed with me for many years, with it being one horror that isn't easy to forget, for many reasons. Particular scenes linger in the mind, however, it's its unique delivery that will make you want to return time and time again.
Kicking off at number 5, The Resurrected, 1991.
It was uncanny. It could have been a portrait of Charles himself.
What do you mean?
I mean, Kerwin looked exactly like Charles.
And what better way to celebrate part 10 of this series other than to highlight a forgotten gem from our other favourite facet of horror fiction, Howard Phillips Lovecraft. The truth is, I'm gonna level with you guys. Creative Commons and the statute of limitations of H.P. Lovecraft's works have not exactly been kind to the true mastery of some of his finer works, and because of that, since the late 70s through to pretty much now, some of the more prolific cinematic adaptations of Lovecraft's stories haven't exactly been great. Granted, I'm not including the works of Stuart Gordon or Brian Yuzna on that point, but it remains the same. Quality and Lovecraft adaptation don't exactly go hand in hand. However, there is one independent movie that quickly sank into the swamps of forgotten horror, and if you can get your hands on this movie, The Resurrected is certainly worth a look at. And also, I should probably preface this with the fact that The Resurrected is kind of difficult to acquire, although I'm pretty sure Scream Factory and a few other outlets have purchase options, so yeah, PSA declared. If you can get it, please get it. And also, it's probably important that we highlight the fact that Dan O'Bannon, as in the writer behind Alien, Total Recall, and many other awesome movies, was the director behind this movie in his second ever attempt at a feature film, his first being The Return of the Living Dead. Yeah, exactly. Dan O'Bannon is reason enough to check this movie out. Directed by O'Bannon and written by Brent Friedman, based upon Lovecraft's 1927 novella The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, The Resurrected stars Jane Sibbett and Chris Sarandon as Claire and Charles Ward respectively. And yes, that is Jane Sibbett as in Carol from Friends, and if you thought Ross Geller was an unabashed psychopath, then Charles Dexter Ward has got something to say about that. You see, Claire Ward hires a private investigator, John March, played by the awesome John Terry, to investigate the increasingly bizarre actions of her husband Charles. And well, if you're familiar with the events of Lovecraft's story, then you'll know it makes for a pretty sublime descent into macabre horror madness. I'll say no more, this movie is a worthy adaptation. It paints a perfect portrait. By no means is it perfect, but it's certainly worth a look. Coming in at number 4, Parents, 1989. Alright, You'll either love this film or you'll hate it, because the very DNA of this film is divisive in nature, and it's a questionable subjective approach to confront what is essentially psychological child abuse with what is also essentially a throwback horror comedy. But for me, it works, and 1989's Parents is a gem of over-amplified yet endearing horror. Directed by Bob Balaban and written by Christopher Hawthorne, Parents tells the story of a 10-year-old kid named Michael and his parents Nick and Lily, who've just moved from Massachusetts to a new neighborhood in 1954 suburbia. Also, turns out that his parents are cannibals and they're in the habit of killing people, chopping them up and serving it to the poor kid, unbeknownst to him, in his spaghetti bolognese. Not cool, parents. Not cool at all. Yeah, listen, this film was an absolute flop at the box office, and Balaban's foray into feature filmmaking never truly recovered. But if you scratch away the surface, Parents is just an incredibly entertaining and straight up grotesque display of mom and pop suburban horror. While the tone may be off in some parts, the fact that we see this whole thing through the eyes of a child is horrifying enough. Next up at number 3, The Gate, 1987. And for many people throughout the 90s, this was the film that would randomly pop up late at night on a rerun horror channel, unsuspectingly to scare the living daylight out of us kids. For a kid, 1987's The Gate is actually a terrifying movie, but watching it later in life, it's such an entertaining horror flick that it's hard to pass it by. And also, given that this film was given a meager $2.5 million budget for what was essentially intended to be a blockbuster feature, it's incredible what was stylistically achieved. Written by Michael Nankin and directed by Tibor Takacs, The Gate is essentially the Goonies for lovers of Lovecraftian fiction. The plot follows a kid called Glenn who, alongside his buddies, discover a portal to a nightmarish domain of evil gods right in his backyard. And what plays out is a classic tale of a bunch of ramshackle suburban kids trying to battle the forces of evil. But this film shines in its small nuanced scenes where the true horror begins to reveal itself. I don't really want to ruin anything, but there's a scene where Glenn dreams that he's dancing with what he thinks is his dead mother, but it turns out to be something much more horrifying than that. Give this one a watch, you'll have fun either way. Swinging in at number 2, Opera, 1987. Oh man, this film is insane. We briefly spoke about Italian giallo horror a week or so ago, and 1987's Opera is perhaps one of the best modern demonstrations of this strange and alluring style of horror cinema. Also known as Terror at the Opera, this film was written and directed by Italian cinematic legend Dario Argento, the man also responsible for the fantastic 1977 supernatural thriller Suspiria. And Opera follows the story of a woman named Betty, the unwitting star of an avant-garde production of Verdi's Macbeth, who is stalked by a mysterious and exceedingly violent killer. It's a fantastic, horrific mystery, and stylistically is a frantic joy to watch. The thing is though, director Dario Argento refused to budge when the studio tried to cut the last 11 minutes of this film, and because of that, Opera was never released theatrically, only being made available in the US as a VHS release. I think perhaps if it was released fully to theatres, then this film would have cemented its place amongst the greats of horror cinema. 1987 was a year of hits and misses for horror cinema, but Opera would have probably taken the box office if it had the chance. And finally, our number 1 spot, Kronos, 1993. And damn it, I just love this film, and for those of you that don't know, Kronos is the first feature film ever made by the main man himself, Guillermo del Toro, although widely it never truly received the recognition that it deserved. Released in 1993 and written and directed by Guillermo del Toro, Kronos tells the story of Jesus Gris, a religious antiques dealer who miraculously comes into possession of an ancient mechanical scarab-like device that inadvertently dishes out the power of eternal life. But by eternal life, what we really mean is vampirism. It's interesting though because like with most of Del Toro's work, this isn't exactly a film about vampires, yet relies on his painfully original blend of mythology and religious iconography to deliver an authentic tale of fantasy and suspense rooted in atmospheric horror. Again, like with most of his work, Kronos could easily be lifted straight from the folklore of South America and Europe, none of which is based in oversaturated gore, but instead delivered as the dark horror and violence of humanity's brush with the magical and the mystic. As Del Toro painfully continues to remind us, there is a price to pay for the curious, and Kronos is great if you're curious, so just give it a watch.
Coming in at number 5, we have House of the Devil. After his incredible fall from grace with Cabin Fever 2, which he went on to disown, Ty West became an instant genre director to watch following his 2009 masterpiece, House of the Devil, which starred Greta Gerwig. That's right, Greta Gerwig, aka the director of Little Women. This horror film concerns a young college student who was hired as a babysitter at an isolated house and is soon caught up in a bizarre and dangerous event as she fights for her life. The film combines elements of both the slasher film and haunted house subgenres while using the satanic panic of the 1980s as a central plot element. House of the Devil is a delightfully old-fashioned tale of Satanism that remains one of the best things to come out of the vintage-tinged horror throwback. Now, eager for a sum of cash that could turn her life around, our protagonist Sam ignores all the red flags along the way until it is far too late and House of the Devil delivers maximum impact. It's a slow burn, that's for sure, but simultaneously creepy and beautiful. The film received hugely positive reviews, with Rotten Tomatoes gifting it an 87% with the general consensus reading. Though its underlying themes are familiar, House of the Devil effectively sheds the loud and gory cliches of contemporary horror to deliver a tense, slow-building throwback to the fright flicks of decades past. The movie suffocates you with its smouldering atmospheric dread and shocking moments of blunt violence. It is a must-watch.
Swinging in at number 4, The Hole, 2001.
No, Mike, listen.
Please stop torturing yourself, okay? Please. It's not important anymore, okay? It's not your fault.
I have to tell you something.
You know what? I was pretty damn adventurous as a kid, but then I saw The Hole and I thought twice about poking my head around abandoned underground bunkers. I'm just kidding. You can't keep a good spelunker down, but still, this movie is certainly food for thought when it comes to making consequential decisions as a young adult. It's also absolutely crazy that this movie was made nearly 20 years ago. That's 2 decades. But also, it's quite enlightening to know that 2001's The Hole was certainly a demonstration of capturing a time and a place, and I think that's exactly why this movie is so appealing in hindsight. This movie is so 90s/early 2000s that it hurts, and it exemplifies a period of British horror where the new millennium had made way for a much more transatlantic kind of horror. And that's not necessarily a bad thing at all, but please know that this movie is dripping with more angst than a Hawthorne Heights record that just made pen pals with a bootleg Dirt and Grey poster on a live journal thread. Yeah, exactly. Directed by Nick Ham and written by Ben Court and Caroline Ip, The Hole is based upon the 1991 psychological horror by Guy Burr. It tells the tale of 4 well-off preparatory students, Liz, Frankie, Mike and Jeff, who after spending a weekend partying in an underground bunker, as you do, find themselves locked inside with no way out. And oh yeah, did I mention that it stars the awesome Thora Birch and Keira Knightley respectively, who throughout this movie are both absolutely brilliant alongside Desmond Harrington and Lawrence Fox as the 2 convincingly decadent male blackguards Mike and Jeff. This movie is awesome and it's reminiscent of some of the more shocking psychological thrillers that flew under the radar during the mid to late 90s, but more importantly it made that style palatable for an emerging horror audience. Really, if this movie flew past you, I'd certainly give it a second look. Yeah, the plot is a little obvious, but it's not about that, it's about performance. And again, Thora Birch is remarkable in this movie. Also, it has a supporting role by Embeth Davitt, aka Miss Honey from Matilda, and all is good in the world. So give it a watch just for that, really. Next up at number 3, The People Under the Stairs, 1991.
Children misbehaving in the basement and one in the wall doing his business, God knows where.
And talking of performance, wowza, I'm not sure if I'll ever forget the terrifying sound of Mrs. Robeson screaming at Alice to get in the bathtub, but truth be told, we have covered this movie before, quite a while ago in fact. But considering it's our 10th episode, I think it's proper that we pull it back out of the vaults or the strange crawl space between the walls and give praise to one of Wes Craven's strangest and most overlooked of horror movies. You see, riding off the success of Nightmare on Elm Street, I'm not entirely sure whether people knew what to expect from this movie following its release 7 years later. I mean, between that you had 1988's The Serpent and the Rainbow, a 1989 shocker, so stylistically I'm sure audiences were expecting an amalgamation of the three. You see, it's not that at all. The People Under the Stairs was a flat-out curveball from Wes Craven, and this movie is so unashamedly weird that several of the taboo themes that it handles could have gone the complete other way with audiences. But you know what? They didn't. Strangely enough, at the time this movie was a surprise commercial success, and I think in that sense it affirms exactly why these forgotten movies are so important for us to rediscover now. Yes, granted, The People Under the Stairs is perhaps one of our more recognisable forgotten horror movies, and in that sense, please don't begrudge me if you've heard of it, you're not the only one. But hey, it's episode 10, and I'm trying to make a point here. Horror cinema has so many of these gems that deserve a second look in, and for new emerging audiences of horror, there is a lot to be learned in The People Under the Stairs. Surprisingly enough, this movie is a weird satire of late-stage capitalism, and as far as characterization goes, it proves the point that with two weird enough villains and two awesome actors to deliver it, you can make even the most nonsensical of plots turn into a worthy horror show. Really, Brandon Adams, Everett McGill, and AJ Langer are awesome in this movie, but Wendy Roby as Mrs. Robertson steals the show. If you haven't had the pleasure of watching this movie quite yet, give it a look. Coming in at number 2, Ghost Story, 1981.
We can feel things watching us and following us. And we dismiss them as fantasies.
Tell me guys, how is it that a worthy cinematic adaptation of one of the greatest works of horror fiction from the 20th century manages to find itself falling down the back of the dusty old shelf without a second look in? Beats me. But you know what's worse? This film has got 37% on Rotten Tomatoes. How? I do not know, and yet whilst this movie is far from being perfect, I think it's down to us individuals to be the judge of Ghost Story's true horror merits. For those of you that are already aware of Peter Straub's colossal horror novel of the same name, you'll know that it's one of the finest demonstrations of how to spin a classic ghostly tale, and whilst that particular horror trope is often overworked and underpaid, if you're looking for a familiar ghost story of the cinematic variety, then this movie is exactly that. I'm still scratching my head as to how this film became so poorly received, and yes, I do understand the criticisms of it, and I don't think that they're too far from being wrong. Ghost Story is indeed slow, it is drawn out, it irks on being rambling at points, but my word, if this film isn't the demonstration of creeping dread in a candlelit room flickering with the shadows of a haunted past, I'm not sure what else would suffice. And also, this movie is a different kind of forgotten cautionary tale that could certainly use a look in this day and age. Oh, also, did I mention that this movie stars frickin' Fred Astaire? Yeah. Exactly. Directed by John Irvin and written by Lawrence D. Cohen, Ghost Story is set during the frigid winter of 1979 in the small New England town of Millburn, where 4 elderly friends, the businessman Ricky Hawthorne, the lawyer Sears James, Dr. John Jaffrey, and the mayor Edward Charles Wanderley, convene for their weekly gathering. They are members of the Chowder Society, an informal men's club that gets together each week to tell tales of horror whilst they sip cognac for the sheer joy of it. I'll say no more because this film needs its slow creep of a narrative to get going, but as I said, this movie is all about performance. Fred Astaire, Melvin Douglas, Douglas Fairbanks Jr. and John Houseman undoubtedly carry this film as the hallmarks of cinema that they are, and Alice Krieg is also remarkable in this movie, but part and parcel of Ghost Story depends on which way you view the resolution of its closing scenes. There is a real sense of something remarkable in this film that I can't quite place, but it's worth finding that out for yourself. You see, it was said that during the filming for Ghost Story, Fred Astaire felt that he was going to die or be murdered, so much so that he considered dropping out of the production. Ghost stories, they really can get to you. And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, Symptoms, 1974.
Did you hear that? What? There it is again.
And for the number 1 entry of part 10 of this forgotten horror movie series, we have to highlight the literal definition of a forgotten horror movie. Really, following its completion and subsequent premiere at the 1974 Cannes Film Festival as the first ever official British entry, Symptoms pretty much disappeared several years later. You see, the original prints of this movie were missing for over 3 decades, with the last ever showing of this movie being on the BBC back in 1983. After that, poof, gone. Disappeared with no clue as to why, when, or who had them. For many years, bootlegs of Symptoms were circulated privately by collectors, but between 1983 and up until recently, this movie was effectively forgotten from the halls of horror cinema. And then, in February of 2016, the British Film Institute saved the day, and now, as well as being available on DVD for your own collection, is also available on YouTube right this minute. So please guys, check it out. Because Symptoms is a remarkable entry in horror cinema, and it stars one of the most underrated female actors in 1970s British horror, Angela Pleasance, who is indeed the daughter of Donald Pleasance, Dr. Samuel Loomis himself. Written and directed by exploitation horror aficionado Jose Larraz, Symptoms tells the tale of the reclusive Helen Ramsey, who invites her friend Anne to stay with her for the weekend at her family's estate. And by estate, I mean absolutely huge English manor covered by a dense impenetrable forest that hasn't seen a glimpse of the outside world for the past few centuries. Warning signs already, right? You see, Helen has been away for years, working as a translator abroad before returning to her family's native England, where she had spent her childhood alongside Anne before leaving. The point is, there may well be reason for that, and soon we realise that Helen is full of far more inconsistencies of a much more terrifying kind of manner. I'll say no more because in classic British exploitation horror kind of fashion, this movie relies on its twisting and turning narrative to keep us on our toes, but most importantly, visually speaking, this movie is the definition of visual dread. This movie is just creepy to watch. It fills you with a weird sense of dread, its lingering camera is unnerving, and the performances from both Angela Pleasance and Lorna Hellebrand are terrifyingly brilliant, with Peter Vaughan, who plays Brady, also being of note. You see, as far as forgotten horror cinema is concerned, Symptoms is perhaps the closest that we'll ever come to defining the term, and that's why it takes our #1 spot for part 10 of this series. Look how far we've come.